Chapter 12, Edward 1327, by Charles Oman. Seldom did a son contrast so strangely with his father, as did Edward of Carnarvon, with Edward the Hammer of the Scots. The mighty warrior and statesman begot a shiftless, thriftless craven, who did his best to bring to rack and ruin all that his sire had built up. The younger Edward's character had been the cause of much misgiving to the old king during the last years of his life. He had already shown himself incorrigibly idle and apathetic, refusing to bear his share of the burdens of royalty, and wasting his time with worthless favorites. The chief of his friends was one Piers de Gaveston, a young Gascon knight whom his father, much to his own sorrow, had made one of his household. Piers was a young man of many accomplishments, clever, brilliant, and showy, who kept a bitter tongue for all save his master, and had an unrivaled talent for making enemies. He kept the listless prince amused, and in return Edward gave him all he asked, which was no small grant, for Piers was both greedy and extravagant. The new king was neither cruel nor vicious, but he was inconceivably obstinate, idle, and thriftless. It has been happily said of him that he was the first king of England since the conquest who was not a man of business. Hitherto the descendants of William the Norman had retained a share of their ancestors' energy. Even the weak Henry III had been a busy, bustling man, ready to meddle and muddle with all affairs of state, great or small. But Edward II took no interest in anything. The best thing that his apologists find to say of him is that he showed some liking for farming. The moment that his father was dead, Edward broke up the great army that had been mustered at Carlisle and returned home. If the campaign had been pursued, there was every chance of crushing Bruce, whose position was still most precarious, for all the fortresses of the land were held by the English, and most of the Scottish nobles still refused to join the pretender. But Edward only sent north a small force under the Earl of Pembroke, which made no head against the forces of Bruce. When Edward settled down in his kingship, the English nation found itself confronted by a new problem: how to deal with a king who altogether refused to trouble himself about the governance of the realm. He referred all men who came to him to his good brother Piers, and went about his pleasures without further concern. When, a few months after his accession, he was to wed Isabel, the daughter of the King of France, he went oversea, leaving the regency in the hands of the Gascon upstart, whom he created Earl of Cornwall, granting him the old royal earldom that had been held by the descendants of Richard, the brother of Henry III. He also gave him in marriage his niece, the daughter of the Earl of Gloucester, and lavished upon him a number of royal estates. Baronage and people alike were moved to wrath by seeing the king hand over the governance of the realm to his favorite. The proud nobles who had been content to bend before Edward's father would not for a moment yield to a king who was but the creature of Gaveston. Troubles began almost immediately on the young king's accession. He was besought, in and out of Parliament, to dismiss the Gascon. He bowed before the storm, and sent him out of England for the moment, but only to give him higher honors by making him Lord Deputy of Ireland. When the king recovered from his fright, Gaveston was recalled, and returned more powerful and more arrogant than before, 1309. Meanwhile, the war in Scotland was going very badly. Many of the nobles, after long doubting, joined Bruce, because they saw that they were likely to get little protection from the feeble king whom they had hitherto served. Several important places fell into the insurgents' hands, and it was universally felt that only a great expedition headed by the king himself could stay Bruce's progress. Edward, however, was enduring too much trouble at home to think of reconquering Scotland. The barons were moving again, headed by three personal enemies of Gaveston's, whom he is said to have mortally offended by the nicknames he had bestowed on them. The first was the king's cousin, 19, Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, a turbulent, ambitious man who covered a scheming love of power by an affectation of patriotism and disinterestedness. The other two were Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, 20, and Guy Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick. Gaveston's name for Lancaster was the actor, which, indeed, well hit off his pretense of unreal virtue. Pembroke he called Joseph the Jew, and Warwick the Black Dog of Arden. It was these three lords who in 1310 led an attack in Parliament on the king and his favorite, and drew up a scheme for taking the direct rule of the realm out of their hands. Following the precedent of the provisions of Oxford, Edward signed everything readily, but immediately departed. Into the north, bade Gaveston return to England and join him, and published a repudiation of the new ordinances, as forced on him by threats and violence, 1311. This contumacy brought matters to a head. Lancaster and his friends took arms and laid siege to Scarborough, where the favourite lay. Gaveston surrendered on a promise that he should have a fair trial in Parliament. But while he was being taken southward, the Earl of Warwick came upon his keepers, drove them away, and took Piers out of their hands. Without trial or form of justice, the Black Dog of Arden bade his retainers behead the favourite by the wayside on Blacklow Hill, May 1312. Thomas of Lancaster approved by his presence this gross and faithless violation of the terms on which Gaveston had surrendered at Scarborough. This outburst of lawless baronial vengeance removed Edward's favourite, but did the realm no other good. The king was compelled to pardon Gaveston's murderers, but he could not be forced to forget what they had done, and even his slow and craven heart conceived projects of revenge. But these had to be postponed for a time to the pressing needs of the Scotch War. Bruce had taken Perth in 1312, Edinburgh and Roxburgh fell to him in the following year, and he was besieging Stirling, the last important stronghold still in English hands. Even Edward was stirred. He bade all England arm, and vowed to march to the relief of Stirling in the next spring. A great host mustered under the royal banner, but Thomas of Lancaster factiously refused to appear, on the plea that the ordinances of 1311 forbade the king to go out to war without the consent of Parliament. This act alone is a sufficient proof that Thomas was a mere self-seeking politician, and not the patriot that he would fain have appeared. King Edward, with an army that is rated at nearly 100,000 men by the chronicler, pushed on to relieve Stirling, and met no opposition till he reached the burn of Bannock, 2 miles south of that town. There he found Bruce and his host of 40,000 men posted on a rising ground, with the brook and a broad bog in his front. On their flanks, the Scots had protected themselves by digging many pits lightly covered with earth and brushwood, so as to break the charge of the English PG 175 horse. Edward displayed all the marks of a bad general. Instead of endeavoring to use his superior numbers to turn or surround the enemy, he flung them recklessly on the Scottish front. When his archers, who by themselves might have settled the battle, had been driven away by the Scots horse, he pushed his great array of mailed knights against the solid masses of Bruce's infantry. After struggling through brook and bog, the English came to a standstill before the steady line of spears. Charge after charge was made, but the knights could not break through the sturdy pikemen, and at last recoiled in disorder. At this moment, a mass of Scottish camp followers came rushing over the hill on the left, and were taken by the exhausted English for a new army. Edward's great host broke up and fled, the king himself stripping his followers, and never halting till he reached Dunbar. The Earl of Gloucester, 6 other barons, 200 knights, and many thousand men of PG 176 lower rank were left upon the field. The Earls of Hereford and Angus, and 70 knights were taken prisoners. The fight of Bannockburn completely did away with the last chance of the union of England and Scotland. The English garrisons surrendered, and the Scots of the English party yielded themselves to Bruce, save a few who, with the Earls of Athol and Buchan, took refuge south of the border. For the future Bruce was undisputed king beyond the Tweed, and instead of acting upon the defensive, was able to push forward and attack England. His ambition was completely satisfied, and his long toils and wanderings ended in splendid success. His whole career, however, was that of a hardy adventurer rather than that of a patriotic king, and his triumph estranged 2 nations which had hitherto been able to dwell together in amity, and plunged them for nearly 3 centuries into bloody border wars. It was from the atrocities committed by Englishmen on Scot and Scot on Englishmen during the fatal years 1306-14 that the long national quarrel drew its bitterness. And for all this Bruce, who commenced his reign by treason, murder, and usurpation, is largely responsible. Edward I must take his full share of blame for his hard hand and heart, but Bruce's ambition masquerading as patriotism must bear as great a load of guilt. The shame which King Edward brought home from the ignominious day of Bannockburn lowered him yet further in his subjects' eyes. The Earl of Lancaster, who had avoided participating in the defeat by his unpatriotic refusal to go forth with the king, was now able to take the administration of affairs into his hands. He dismissed all Edward's old servants, put him on an allowance of £10 a day for his household expenses, and for some years was practically ruler of the realm. Lancaster might have passed for an able man if he had not laid his hand on the helm of the state, but he guided matters so badly that he soon wrecked his own reputation both for ability and for patriotism. 1314-18. The generals of the Scottish king crossed the border and ravaged the country as far as York and Preston, and at the same time, Edward Bruce, the brother of Robert, sailed over to Ireland with an army and began to raise the native Irish against their PG 177 rulers. The great tribes of the O'Neills and the O'Connors joined him, in the hope of completely expelling the English, and by their aid Edward Bruce was crowned King of Ireland and swept over the whole country from Antrim to Kerry, burning the towns and castles of the English settlers. It is from these unhappy years, 1315-17, that we may date the weakening of the royal authority in Ireland and the restriction of English rule to the eastern coast. The Pale about Dublin, Dundalk, and Wicklow. When the war seemed over, and the victory of Edward Bruce certain, the dissensions of the Irish ruined his cause. Lord Mortimer routed Edward's allies the O'Connors at Athenry in 1317, and the King of Ireland himself and his Scottish followers were cut to pieces at Dundalk, a year later, by the Chief Justice, John de Birmingham. Dublin and the Pale were thus saved, but little or no progress was made in restoring the King of England's authority in the rest of the land. Though victorious in Ireland, the English under Lancaster's rule were unable to keep their own borders safe. Bruce took Berwick, ravaged Durham, and cut the whole shire levy of Yorkshire to pieces at Mitten Bridge. In despair, Lancaster asked for a truce, and obtained it, 1320. But the temporary cessation of the Scottish War only gave the opportunity for the English to come to blows in civil strife. Thomas of Lancaster had by this time made so many enemies that the king was able to gather together a party against him. Though slow and idle, Edward was unforgiving, and well remembered that he had Gaveston's blood to avenge. He found his chief supporters in the two Despensers, West Country barons, the son and grandson of that Despenser who had been Simon de Montfort's justiciar and had fallen at Evesham. Taking advantage of the times, Edward assembled an army under the plea that he must chastise a baron named Battlesmere, who had rudely excluded Queen Isabella from Leeds Castle, in Kent, when she wished to enter. Having taken Leeds and hung its garrison, the king, with a most unexpected show of energy, suddenly turned on Lancaster. Earl Thomas called out his friends, and the Earl of Hereford, Lord Mortimer, and many of the barons of the Welsh marches rose in his favor. He was forced, however, to fly north when the king pursued him, and had made his way as far as Boroughbridge in PG 178 Yorkshire, when he found himself intercepted by the shire levies of the north, headed by Harclay, the governor of Carlisle. A battle followed, in which Hereford was slain and Lancaster taken prisoner. The king was now able to wreak his long-delayed vengeance for Gaveston's murder. He sent Earl Thomas to the block, and hung or beheaded 8 barons and 30 knights of his party. Lord Mortimer and the rest were stripped of their lands and banished. These wholesale executions and confiscations not only provoked the baronage, but caused the nation to look on Earl Thomas as a martyr, though he was in fact nothing better than a selfish and turbulent adventurer. Edward, having taken his revenge, subsided into his former listlessness and sloth, handing over the whole conduct of affairs to his new ministers, the two Despensers. Father and son alike were unwise, greedy, and arrogant. They used the king's name for their own ends, and soon made themselves as well hated as Gaveston had been 10 years before. Yet for 4 years they maintained themselves in power, even after they had advised the king to take the necessary but unpopular step of acknowledging Bruce as King of Scotland and concluding a truce for 13 years with him. The slothful Edward and the arrogant Despensers soon tired out the patience of England, and they fell before the first blow leveled against them. The blow came from an unexpected quarter. Edward's wife, Isabella of France, was visiting the court of her brother, Charles IV, on a diplomatic mission concerning some frontier feuds in Guienne. At Paris, she met and became desperately enamored of the exiled Marcher baron, Roger Mortimer. He drew her into a conspiracy against her husband. By his advice, she induced her young son Edward, the heir of England, to cross over and join her. When the boy was safely in her hands, she sent to King Edward to bid him dismiss the Despensers, because they had wronged and insulted her. When he refused, she and Mortimer gathered a force of Flemish mercenaries and crossed to England. They had already enlisted the support of the kinsmen and friends of Lancaster, Hereford, Battlesmere, PG 179, and the other barons who had been slain in 1322. On landing in Suffolk, Isabella was at once joined by them, and found herself at the head of a large army. Edward and his unpopular ministers fled towards Wales, but the elder Despenser was caught at Bristol and promptly hanged. His son Hugh and the king were captured 3 weeks later. The former was executed, while his master was taken under guard to London, November 1326. The queen then summoned a parliament in the name of her son, Prince Edward. Articles were placed before it, accusing the king of breaking his coronation oath, of willfully neglecting the right governance of the land, of promoting unworthy favorites, of losing Scotland and Ireland, and of slaying his enemies without just cause or a fair trial. The Parliament pronounced him unfit to reign, deposed him, and elected his young son to fill his throne in his stead. Edward was constrained by force to resign his crown and at once thrown into prison. He was first consigned to the charge of Henry of Lancaster, the brother of Earl Thomas, but Henry kept him safely, and there were those who did not desire his safety. Presently the Queen and Mortimer took him from Lancaster's hands and removed him to Berkeley Castle. There he was treated with gross neglect and cruelty, in the deliberate design of ending his life. But when his constitution proved strong enough to resist all privations, his keepers secretly put him to death, September 21, 1327. Thus ended the unhappy son of Edward I, the victim of an unfaithful wife, and a knot of barons bent on revenging an old blood feud. That he deserved his fate it would be hard to say, but that he owed it entirely to his own, unwise choice of favorites it is impossible to deny.